Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. It's not an easy job committing fraud on the scale which climate alarmists are, so I thought I'd give them some assistance. I've developed some new software which will give them a boost in identifying which critical data they should be hiding. But first, there's some important news out of Washington, D.C. They've identified a panel of experts who will be setting our nation's climate policy. Apparently, the Democrats felt they needed people who were better educated than AOC or Greta. Now let's review the problem which my software will help climate alarmists solve. This is the main page from the part of the National Climate Assessment which went out to journalists and policymakers. This page contains a lot of graphics. Here's one which shows heat waves increasing since 1960. Here's another one which shows Arctic sea ice declining since 1979. And another one which shows wildfires increasing since 1983. And one more which shows sea level rising since 1920. So we have one graph which starts in 1960, another which starts in 1979, another which starts in 1920, and one more which starts in 1983. When you want to mislead people with statistics, picking your start date is very important. First, let's look at the heat wave graph which starts in 1960. They carefully picked a period during the global cooling scare to start their graph so that they could show heat waves increasing over time. And here's the underlying data from the part of the National Climate Assessment which didn't go out to journalists and politicians. This graph is warm spells days, this one is heat wave magnitude, and this one is warmest temperature of the year. As you can see, summers were much hotter in the United States prior to 1960. So by hiding all the data before 1960, they were able to show a little bit of an upwards trend. I overlaid the part of the graph which went out to policymakers over here in this corner on top of the underlying data, and you can see exactly what they did. The red bars are what policymakers saw, and the extreme heat prior to 1960 is what they didn't see. People may consider this sort of behavior to be shocking, but it's actually standard operating procedure for climate alarmists. This graph shows in pink all the data that was hidden from journalists and policymakers. This next graph is the one which shows wildfires increasing in the U.S. since 1983. And this graph of U.S. forest fires from the U.S. Forest Service is the one which didn't go out to journalists and politicians. And you can see why they hid all the data before 1983, because there was a lot more burn acreage in the United States prior to 1983. Burn acreage in the U.S. is down about 80% since the 1930s. This shouldn't be surprising to anyone because it was very hot and dry during the 1930s. Fires are associated with heat and droughts. There's very close correlation between heat waves and burn acreage. This next graphic overlays the graph which went out to journalists and policymakers over here on top of the data which didn't go out to journalists and policymakers. You can see the breathtaking fraud which is going on here. They carefully cherry-picked one year where they could show an increasing trend in wildfires, even though U.S. wildfires are down 80%. And this graph shows in pink all the data that was hidden. Now let's look at the Arctic sea ice extent graph, which starts in 1979. Starting in 1979 makes it look like sea ice extent is decreasing linearly. And now let's look at the data which is being hidden. This graph is from the 1990 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. It shows Arctic sea ice extent all the way back to the early 1970s. And as you can see, extent was much lower prior to 1979, and 1979 was the peak. The data was taken from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And here's the accompanying text from the 1990 IPCC report. Satellite observations have been used to map sea ice extent routinely since the early 1970s. The American Navy Joint Ice Center has produced weekly charts which have been digitized by NOAA. And down here is the key sentence. In 1972 to 1975, sea ice extent was significantly less. So they hid the data before 1979 and tried to use the excuse that we didn't have satellite data prior to 1979. But the IPCC report said the exact opposite. Satellite observations have been used to map sea ice extent routinely since the early 1970s. This shouldn't surprise anyone because we went to the moon in 1969. We actually have satellite data from earlier than that. This is from the February 1965 issue of National Geographic. It's a satellite photo of Arctic sea ice looking down on the North Pole. It's pretty clear why the National Climate Assessment is hiding all the pre-1979 data, because it would wreck their linear downwards trend line. Here's one more graphic showing U.S. sea level rising over the past century, as if sea level around the U.S. could somehow be different than it is in the rest of the world. So now let's look at what they're hiding. Sea level has been rising at the same rate for thousands of years. This graph from NOAA is made from data from the tide gauge at Lower Manhattan. It shows that sea level has been rising at a steady rate since the middle of the 19th century. Abraham Lincoln, 2.84 millimeters per year. Teddy Roosevelt, 2.84 millimeters per year. Franklin Roosevelt, 2.84 millimeters per year. Jimmy Carter, 2.84 millimeters per year. And during Donald Trump's first term, it's also 2.84 millimeters per year. In other words, there's no indication that humans have had any impact on the rate of sea level rise. And if we go back even further, we can see that sea level has actually been rising for about 20,000 years. 20,000 years ago, sea level was about 120 meters or 400 feet lower than it is now. Anthropologists believe that during this time when sea level was very low, people were able to walk across from Siberia to North America, and that's how the first humans got here. From about 14,000 years ago to 8,000 years ago, sea level rose very quickly, but since then it's been quite slow. Climate alarmists want you to believe that this 400 feet of sea level rise is all natural, but somehow the last few inches were man-made. It's not easy work for climate alarmists to find the best point to start their phony graphs at, so I've developed some software to help them out. This graph shows the number of days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit at Waverly, Ohio for every year going back to 1895. You can see that there used to be a lot of 90-degree days at Waverly. Let me hover over this point. This is 1936. They had 82 90-degree days in 1936 at Waverly, Ohio. Now let's look at 1895. They had 73 days over 90 degrees in 1895. How about 1930? 1930 also had 73 days over 90 degrees. The year 1900 had 63 days over 90 degrees. So you can see that Waverly, Ohio had a lot of very hot summers prior to the year 1943, but since then summers have been much cooler there. And this diagonal downwards line shows the trend since the 1890s. The trend is about 26 fewer 90-degree days per century at Waverly, Ohio. My video this morning was about Iowa academics misrepresenting the trend in 90-degree days in Iowa. So the last thing which climate alarmists want the public to see is a downward trend in the number of hot days, which is actually occurring over most of the country. So in order to fool the public into believing that hot weather is increasing in the United States, they have to carefully cherry-pick their start date. And my software will help them do that. Let me show you how. I'm going to drag the graph over to the left, and you're going to see the trend line change as I do. Alright, here we go. I'm going to drag the graph, and you're going to see the trend line change dramatically. There we go. It's still going down, still going down, still going down. Whoa, now it's going up. That's exactly what climate alarmists want. So if you want to defraud the public about heatwave trends at Waverly, Ohio, the perfect start date is 1955. And the really cool thing is that with my software, you can do this with any kind of data, any kind of graph. Climate alarmists will be able to find the perfect cheating point for every single data set in the world. I'm open to suggestions what I should name this climate fraud tool, and I think I should charge them a lot of money for it. Going back to being serious, you might have noticed that I've been posting a lot of graphics recently. That's because the software enables me to find all kinds of interesting information which I wasn't aware of previously. I do intend to commercialize it at some point, but that's probably a few months off. So we can see that massive fraud is going on in climate science. Now let's look at some of the reasons why this is happening. Most climate scientists are just keeping their mouths closed because they have to. If they open their mouths, they'd lose their career, they'd lose their income, and they would be thoroughly trashed. But for some, it's the revolutionary mentality. This is an amazing email I got from the American Association for the Advancement of Science. They said, Achieving these greenhouse gas limits will require rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. This is about overthrowing our government, our freedom, and our way of life. It's more difficult to convince adults of their lies, so they've co-opted children who are very innocent and don't know any better. They had millions of school children out of school today as part of their mass propaganda campaign. The Green New Deal reads like the Communist Manifesto. In 2010, one of the leading officials of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said, "We redistribute de facto the world's wealth by climate policy. One has to free oneself from the illusion that international climate policy is environmental policy. That has almost nothing to do with environmental policy anymore." The New York Times wants people to panic because they know that panicked people are very easy to manipulate. And the Washington Post also wants people to panic, saying that the world's going to end in a little over 11 years. Same story is from the UN 30 years ago. June 30th, 1989. Grim forecast. A senior environmental official at the United Nations, Noel Brown, says entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea levels if global warming is not reversed by the year 2000. Climate alarmists want you to believe that this is a scientific thing, not a political one. In 2013, President Obama tweeted that 97% of the world's scientists agree that we're in a climate crisis. That same year, the American Meteorological Society took a survey of their professional members. They were asked, is global warming happening? If so, what is its cause? Look at the results for the top row. Yes, mostly human. 52% of respondents agreed with that, and only 37% of professional forecasters. So just over one-half of all professional members of the American Meteorological Society agreed that global warming was mostly man-made, and just over one-third of professional forecasters. They were not asked if global warming was dangerous or if we're in a crisis. They probably would have been laughed at had they asked such a ridiculous question. What we're seeing is an attempt to overthrow our government and way of life by some very unscrupulous people. They are willing to lie, cheat, and abuse children in order to achieve their political goals. The key thing which all the sane people need to do is to force the EPA into doing a reevaluation of the CO2 endangerment finding. That is the legal document which will allow climate alarmists to destroy our way of life. Tell your politicians and everyone you know that they need to demand that the EPA CO2 endangerment finding is revisited. That is the critical thing in getting the scam stopped. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.